Neil Mcfarlane is Associate Professor of Government and Foreign Affairs and Director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Virginia. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. From 1979 to 1982, he was tutor of international relations at Oxford. During the next 2 years, he was a research fellow at Harvard, and then in 1984, he received his appointment at the University of Virginia. Professor Mcfarlane is the author of a number of scholarly publications, among them Superpower Rivalry and Third World Radicalism, published in 1985, and Gorbachev's Third World Dilemma, published in 1989. He is currently at work on the USSR and the Third World, to be published by the Cambridge University Press. Will you join me then in welcoming him to Baltimore, Neil S. Mcfarlane.
Well, I should say at the outset that it may seem a bit odd that someone who spends so much time thinking about Soviet policy in the Third World is now dealing with a topic relating to Soviet domestic politics. But then, from my perspective, the Soviet Union resembles the Third World more and more by the week. So, if you'll bear with me. As you all know, there has been a noticeable deterioration in the relationship between the USSR and the United States in recent months. Shifts in Soviet diplomatic behavior on issues relating to the conventional forces in Europe talks, the Gulf, START, and a number of other regional conflicts have raised questions about the durability of the positive evolution in Soviet foreign policy that we've witnessed since the accession to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. We thought that we were seeing a transformation so deep that we began thinking about and speaking of the end of the Cold War and the construction of a new world order based in important respects on close cooperation with the USSR, or alternatively on its gradual fading into irrelevance. Our optimism in this regard was not based only on an assessment of change in Soviet international behavior. It was also based on the evolution of Soviet domestic politics, away from ideologically justified totalitarianism and a centrally planned economy focused on the acquisition of military power, and towards what we perceive to be more pluralistic and democratic economic and political institutions. The recent hardening in Soviet perspectives on a number of key foreign policy issues coincides with the clear conservative trend in Soviet domestic politics and in economic policy. This draws into question our prior assessment of the direction taken by the Soviet polity internally. And this coincidence invites analysis of the relationship between the current trend in Soviet foreign policy and that in Soviet domestic politics, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. In what follows, I'll take a brief look at the changing dimensions of the internal crisis in the USSR and at the Soviet response to that crisis. I shall then examine what I believe to be the implications of change in domestic politics for foreign policy. There are several dimensions to the crisis facing the Soviet leadership today. In general, they stem in part from the legacy of the Brezhnev era. They stem also, however, from the approach taken to the issue of political and economic reform since 1985. In 1985, the Soviet Union faced a situation in which economic growth was negligible and growth in factor productivity was zero or negative. This was connected with the difficulties the USSR, as a centrally planned economic system, faced in the transition from extensive growth to intensive growth. The second and related dimension underlying decaying Soviet economic performance was that as the productive process evolved globally, an increasing premium was placed on technological sophistication in production. And again, the Soviet system had great difficulty in sustaining technological innovation within its own economy. This problem of technology was particularly acute in terms of Soviet national security. weapons development and procurement in the United States in the early and mid-1980s took increasing advantage of developments in non-traditional military technologies, those we've seen so much of on television over the last few weeks, such as laser optics and computer electronics. There was some doubt in Soviet minds that the USSR could keep up, and there was a near certainty in the minds of the Soviet leadership that if they sought to keep up, the effort was likely to be bankrupting. The new leadership, by its own admission, faced in 1985 the prospect that the USSR would slip from the first rank of great powers by the 21st century. Or, as a Soviet scholar who'd perhaps been reading Jerry Huff once put it to me, in Khrushchev's day, Soviet leaders spoke of surpassing the United States, and now they speak of efforts to catch up with Korea. Underlying the economic difficulties facing the USSR in 1985 was a deeper social or moral crisis, greatly affecting Soviet politics, and specifically the capacity of the Soviet leadership to draw upon public goodwill in addressing economic issues. By 1985, the public had become profoundly alienated from their government and from the process of governance in the USSR itself. This was a result in part of being closed out from any meaningful role in the determination of their own destinies. It also drew on popular resentment of elite privilege and the abuse of power for personal gain. It reflected the changing character of Soviet society as it became more urbanized, better educated, as Soviet people, particularly in urban areas, became used to having their basic needs satisfied and came to expect more in material terms. And as increasing contact with the outside made many Soviets more aware of the deficiencies of their own system. And this social and moral crisis was a product, finally, of the increasing hollowness of the ideological claims upon which the Soviet regime based its legitimacy. The consequent social malaise by 1985 was evident in the indifference of the Soviet worker to his product, in the cynicism and opportunism with which the public viewed political affairs, in the tendency of the public to withdraw into their private lives at the expense of state and society, and in various social pathologies such as alcoholism, the collapse of the family unit, rising criminality, and ubiquitous corruption. Reform was intended to address all of these political, economic, and social problems. Restoring the Soviet polity, economy, and society to health was a critical prerequisite to retaining the power and status of the USSR in world affairs. Unfortunately, each of the three tiers of the Soviet reform, that is to say, perestroika or restructuring, glasnost or openness, and demokratizatsiya or democratization, each of these tiers created new problems of their own, in addition to exacerbating old ones. The partial economic reform managed to disorganize rather than reform the economic system. Its legacy now lies, the legacy of the economic reform, now lies in spiraling inflation resulting from deficit finance and from rapid increases in wages without commensurate increases in productivity, and consequently a serious and increasingly serious problem of monetary overhang. There were also growing shortages of essential goods, due not least to a collapse of the distribution system. There were massive increases in the numbers of unfinished capital investment projects, and there was finally a ubiquity of conflicts between public authorities at local, regional, republican, and federal levels over who owns or controls what. Political reform, by which I mean a shift in the locus of power from the party to the state, the growing power of legislative organs, the advent of multi-candidate elections, and the devolution of power from the center to Republican, regional, and local organs, brought about a vacuum at the center, as alternatives to the party had great difficulty in establishing their viability. It also brought a welter of competing claims of sovereignty, as the republics responded to nationalist aspirations and to growing economic discontent by exerting themselves at the expense of the center. Glasnost, the third tier, went well beyond its initial purposes of enhancing the accountability of officials to the public and involving the people more closely in public affairs. It went beyond this to provide a forum for those seeking a dismantlement of the party or the party's role at the apex of Soviet society, for those seeking the delegitimation of the party's historical claim to rule, and for those articulating and disseminating calls for the destruction of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and attacking still powerful central institutions such as the army and the secret police. I'm not, by the way, seeking to defend the traditional status quo or to condemn efforts at reform. I merely seek to underline that the basic effect of the reform process in its first 5 years was to damage seriously the economic mechanism without providing an unambiguous alternative, and to damage the traditional political system without providing effective alternatives or a clear process for developing them. The failure, well, let's leave that aside, actually, in the interests of the question and answer period. To summarize, the USSR had by 1990 landed in a contradictory halfway house between traditional neo-Stalinism and the market economy and political democracy. The result was the gradual but accelerating decline into real crisis by 1990, which was a pivotal year for the Soviet Union. This crisis was marked most notably by the beginnings of very rapid drops in total Soviet output. The New York Times in an editorial made a reference to a 50% drop in output this year, which seems a bit high, but nonetheless gives you some indication of the dimensions of the problem. Soviet citizens faced markedly harder material conditions of life, and consequently they engaged in seriously disruptive and self-reinforcing hoarding behavior, making shortages even worse. The budget deficit ballooned to greater than 10% of GDP, which makes ours look like chicken feed. The center appeared to lose control politically in many of the national republics, and this process of loss of control in 1989 and 1990 was accompanied on some occasions by incipient or actual civil war, as in Azerbaijan, and by a growing, and finally, the crisis produced a deepening of the social malaise and fear of the future on the part of the Soviet population. The people had been promised improvement as a result of reform. What most of them experienced was an increasingly rapid descent into real hardship. Many blamed this on reform itself rather than on the inadequacies of particular strategies of reform or on the difficulties inherent in any effort to alter the neo-Stalinist system, which is not easy to do. As the Chancellor of the Czechoslovak Republic once said, it's easy to take an aquarium and turn it into bouillabaisse, but it's very difficult to take bouillabaisse and make an aquarium out of it. The crisis, as it evolved in 1990, was marked also by increasingly effective resistance on the part of conservatives in the party, at senior ranks of the military, and in the police apparatus to further liberalization. This was evident in the growing chorus of attacks on liberals such as Edvard Shevardnadze and Alexander Yakovlev, and in the increasingly direct complaints of senior military officials about glasnost and efforts to depoliticize the army at the 28th Party Congress in July of 1990. This criticism within the party deepened by the time of the Central Committee plenum in January of this year, with conservatives expressing increasingly open dissatisfaction with the misplaced emphasis on democratization at the expense of economic modernization. They referred to perestroika as a failure. Ivan Polaskov, the the secretary of the Russian Communist Party, referred to this Central Committee plenum as a turning point in Soviet politics and in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He saw it as the beginning of an offensive against those who wanted to reintroduce capitalism. The actions of the leadership itself from the fall of 1990 forward displayed either the mounting influence of conservative forces over Mikhail Gorbachev or his own perception that he faced a moment of choice among at least three alternatives. The first was an accelerating slide into political disorder and economic collapse. The second was the possibility of a reversal of course and the reassertion of power at the center in the economy and in politics. And the third option available was the embrace of a truly radical reform envisaging a rapid transition to the market with all of its attendant dangers, and acquiescence in the movement of republics such as Lithuania towards independence. Either Gorbachev voluntarily accepted a more conservative orientation at this time, or he felt he had no political alternative to it. The period subsequent to the 28th Party Congress in the summer of last year displayed the growing strength of more conservative forces in the Soviet political spectrum across a wide range of issues. The first, I suppose, should be the economic front. Here, the Soviet regime ultimately rejected the more liberal prescriptions contained in the Shatalin Plan and its Yeltsin variation, settling instead for the approach outlined in the Presidential Plan of October 1990. Perhaps the most significant difference between these plans lies in the conception of the role of central government. Gorbachev's preferred approach emphasized the importance of a strong central government with independent financial and macroeconomic powers. By this time, such an approach was simply unacceptable to many of the national republics, and it's not surprising, therefore, that it's at this moment we see a stalling of negotiations supposedly leading to a renewal of the Treaty of Union in the USSR. This suggested a hardening of the center's approach to the question of Republican self-determination, and I'll return to that in a moment. In the meantime, Gorbachev expanded the powers of the presidency to deal with threats to internal security. In the autumn, he replaced moderate officials responsible for law and order with individuals of a more hardline reputation. The replacement of Internal Affairs Minister Vadim Bakatin with Boris Pugo, ex of the KGB and ex-party leader of Latvia in the good old days when Latvia was reliable, is illustrative. The Ministry of Internal Affairs was also strengthened by the transfer of several military units to its control, and by the appointment of Boris Gromov, the last Soviet commander in Afghanistan, as first deputy minister of Internal Affairs. The powers of this ministry and of the KGB to investigate enterprises and joint ventures were noticeably expanded. These administrative actions were followed by a decision to deploy military units in Soviet cities in conjunction with the police to deal supposedly with rising street crime. The most significant impact of this deployment, and I think it was intentionally so, was not so much to deal with street crime as it was to create the impression of martial law. Certainly many Soviets think so. And the goal here presumably being to intimidate the populace. The expansion of the functions and rights of internal security agencies at this time was accompanied by a rhetorical offensive on the part of their leaders, with KGB Chairman Kryuchkov averring at the last session of the Congress of People's Deputies that nationalist agitation in the minority republics was a product of manipulation by foreign intelligence services, including the CIA. The historical echo here, back to periods in which the threat of foreign subversion was used as a pretext for massive violations of human rights and for radical constriction of domestic political life, is particularly chilling. Perhaps the most obvious manifestation of the growing influence of hardline attitudes in Soviet domestic politics lies in the evolution of the center's approach to the national question, to the republics. Several examples are relevant. The first scent of this change in the wind was perhaps the use of Soviet Interior Ministry troops to occupy a press house in Latvia in December of last year. This action was significant not only in itself as an indicator of things to come, but also because the center, i.e. Mikhail Gorbachev, denied responsibility. The local commander claiming that he was acting on orders from the loyalist faction of the Latvian Communist Party. Now, clearly, the Interior Ministry has is not constitutionally or legally obliged to accept orders from local party secretaries, and this suggests that beneath all of the panache of political reform, much remained as it was before Mikhail Gorbachev came into power. A second example of change on the national question was the intimidation of the Republic of Georgia on the issue of Southern Ossetia. Now, I won't go into this in any great detail. You can take my word for it and ask me questions about it, but it deals with the intricacies of Caucasian ethnic politics, and I don't want to drive you to napping. The third measure related to the nationality issue concerned military conscription. During the past year, several of the republics have passed laws in areas relating to the issue of conscription, which ostensibly limited the capacity of the Soviet armed forces to conscript within their territories. This was the subject of much discontent on the part of the military command. They pressured Mikhail Gorbachev to enforce existing Soviet law on conscription in the peripheral republics. Gorbachev acceded to this pressure on December 1st of last year when he issued a decree rejecting the republic's laws pertaining to military service as unconstitutional. An interesting word. And he ordered local and Republican agencies to enforce all Union conscription law. 1 month later, again by presidential decree, he dispatched paratroopers into the Baltics to enforce this earlier decree. This set the stage for the events of mid-January in Lithuania and subsequently in Latvia, in which some 25 citizens of those republics were killed by Soviet troops attacking communications, media, and police facilities. Here again, to my knowledge in any event, at least at that stage, there was no systematic use of these troops to enforce conscription, which was purportedly why they were there. They were used essentially to intimidate local authorities and the population at large. There is some question as to Mikhail Gorbachev's personal responsibility for this event as well. He has denied it, saying that he didn't know what they were going to do and he was just as shocked as everybody else when the bodies started being carried away. This is a speculative matter, and I would be happy to speculate on it later if anybody invites me to do so. The crackdown extended into the media as well. This became particularly evident in coverage of events in Vilnius in Lithuania, although retrospectively it appears that it was prefigured by the appointment of Leonid Kravchenko as head of Gosteli Radio, the Soviet radio and TV administration, late last year. Vremya, the principal TV news program, was reduced to stale repetition of official propaganda on the events in the Baltics, while some commentary shows, such as the Leningrad show, 600 Seconds, produced essentially nothing but a pack of lies on the Lithuanian issue. More liberal commentary on television, such as that provided by the variety show Vzglyad, has essentially just disappeared from the air. We have a Soviet TV system in my office, and so I can watch these things go by. Similarly, distorted views were carried by TASS, the official news agency, and by conservative newspapers such as Pravda and Sovietskaya Rossiya. The propaganda concerning Lithuania was interesting in that all of these media placed a heavy focus on an organization which emerged officially only the day before the crackdown, that being the National Salvation Committee of Lithuania. The origins and membership of this committee are obscure. But central media gave prominent play to its denunciations of the Lithuanian government, giving no play to the Lithuanian government itself. They gave prominent play to its appeals for support from the center and to its claim, that is the claim of the committee, that it had superseded the elected government of the Republic and was governing in its stead. This too evokes echoes of the past. We remember the Soviet fabrication of successive regimes in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan, which then happily provided invitations for Soviets to assist them. The distortion of news in the media extends beyond commentary on the national question, as is evident in the evolving Soviet discussion of the Gulf crisis. Gorbachev weighed in with his own personal view of the media in January by suggesting that essentially the media was acting irresponsibly and therefore the new liberal press law should be suspended, effectively reintroducing censorship. In all of these respects, it appears that the Soviet polity has turned away from pluralist solutions and is returning to an extent to the tired ways of the past. It's important to note, however, that while there appears to be a clear conservative trend in Soviet politics, by contrast to past analogous events, it is small potatoes. To my knowledge, firstly, there have been few, if any, political arrests by the authorities. There is clearly police harassment of opponents of the regime, but it is hardly systematic repression. Secondly, the crackdown in the national republics is hardly comprehensive or complete. For example, in Lithuania, the paratroopers could have attempted a quick takeover of the Lithuanian parliament when they began military action in the center of Vilnius. Had this been done early in the operation, before the population was mobilized to defend parliament, it probably could have been done with few casualties. The Lithuanian government, subsequent to these events, to cite another example, was allowed to proceed with its referendum on self-determination from the USSR. Subsequently, both Estonia and Latvia have proceeded with similar referenda, the results of which are not yet known to me because I haven't read the newspaper today. There has as yet been little interference in the internal politics of the Republic of Georgia or other militantly nationalist republics as part of this crackdown. What happened in Lithuania appears to me, anyway, to have been a rather tentative operation, an effort at intimidation rather than full suppression, an effort designed to induce greater moderation in the Republic leaderships without massive use of force, by demonstrating that the center could act if it wanted to. Thirdly, the tightening up of media control is still quite partial. There are many newspapers in the Soviet Union which continue to air independent perspectives on the issue of the day. Boris Yeltsin, I think it was last week, was allowed access to Soviet national television with a demand that Gorbachev resign. This is hardly full censorship. Fourthly, although the radical economic reform plans, such as the Stalin plan, have been shelved, and there is reason to doubt the efficacy of purely administrative adjustments, such as the withdrawal of 50 and 100 ruble notes from circulation last month, or the projected 60% increase in prices of this month, despite all of this, 1990 was a year of significant progress in the area of economic reform, in legislating elements of elements of reform clarifying policy on property, policy on the enterprise, policy concerning the role of the state in the economy, treatment of joint ventures, incorporation of enterprises, securities markets. In other words, they have continued to set about the process of creating the institutional structures of a liberalized economy. In other words, it's unclear just how far this conservative trend will go, or whether indeed the center has the power necessary in current circumstances to reimpose discipline, even if it chose to do so. In my opinion, for what it's worth, what the government, if there is a cohesive government, is seeking to do is to move towards a model of relatively mild political authoritarianism coupled with the continuation and deepening of the process of economic reform. People cite the Korean experience of economic development in this context as well. Whether this is possible is another matter. Turning finally to foreign policy. There clearly have been negative effects in foreign policy emanating from the conservative trend in domestic politics. As conservative forces have gained strength internally, so too is there growing evidence of the influence of their perspectives on Soviet international behavior. I will cite, I think, 3 examples of this. The first is that the military has apparently developed sufficient autonomy in Soviet politics to resist the full implementation of the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement signed last year. This is evident, for example, in the reclassification of Army motorized divisions as naval and coastal forces, the argument being that, well, we all know that naval forces are not covered by the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement. Another example would be the movement of considerable quantities of equipment, which otherwise would likely have been destroyed, at least in part, out of the European zone covered by CFE, the Conventional Forces Agreement, beyond the Urals. People I talked to in the Soviet Foreign Ministry policy planning staff state, and you can take it or leave it, that these actions were taken by the military without consulting civilian apparatus, and notably the Foreign Ministry, despite the authority of the Foreign Ministry over matters relating to arms control, negotiation, and implementation. Secondly, the resistance of conservatives to Shevardnadze's preference for cooperation with the West on the Iraq question was cited by him in December as one reason for his resignation. Subsequent to his departure at the end of the last year, the Soviet Union became increasingly ambivalent about its cooperation in the United Nations initiative vis-à-vis Kuwait, that it had never really been comfortable with what the United Nations was contemplating, or what we were contemplating, sorry. To judge from Soviet press and TV coverage, this had a considerable amount to do with pressure from elements of the military, which had trouble in accepting such a large American force in proximity to Soviet borders, particularly if that presence became permanent. It also reflected their concern about abandoning a long-standing friend, using the term loosely, in the Middle East, and the possibility that this neglect of an historical ally would be seen as a precedent by other friends of the USSR in the region and elsewhere. More generally, those in the USSR, and particularly in the military, remaining sensitive about Soviet prestige, could hardly be happy about the image of an unconstrained United States acting in proximity to Soviet borders, tacitly, if not explicitly, supported by the USSR in squashing Iraq. Now, this has to do not just with evidence of ambivalence in Soviet diplomatic behavior on Gulf issues. There are also other more disturbing facets to Soviet policy on this issue, small but nonetheless disturbing. For example, the interception of a Soviet ship carrying tank parts to Jordan, which, as my colleague Ilya Prizel, who is with us tonight, noted, they could hardly have been intended to supply tanks in Jordan, since there are no Soviet tanks in Jordan. There are also reports of traffic of military supplies from the Soviet Union across Iran into Iraq. And this raises questions, in my mind anyway, about the extent of political control in the USSR over the military in the context of clear military opposition to the main lines of policy on this subject. Thirdly, there is also some evidence of growing resistance in the Soviet Union to intensive and intrusive verification procedures as part of the START process. This appears to have been perhaps not as important as George Bush's preoccupation with the Gulf question in the postponement of the February Soviet-American summit, but it was nonetheless cited as being important. I'm told that there is some doubt in Washington about who, if anyone, is in control of a number of central aspects of Soviet foreign policy at the moment, and that, too, is reason to avoid going to Moscow, I suppose. Again, things are obviously not what they were in Soviet foreign policy and in Soviet-American relations. Yet again, one can take this conclusion too far. We are hardly back where we were in 1983 or 1985. There are several examples which I can prefer on this subject. First of all, the appointment of Alexander Besmyertnych as Soviet foreign minister to replace Shevardnadze suggests a continuing concern to sustain positive relations with the West. It could have been and was expected to be a lot worse than Besmyertnych. Secondly, Soviet acquiescence last week, I think it was, in the dissolution of the military component of the Warsaw Pact suggests that there has as yet been no official reconsideration of Soviet policy towards Eastern Europe, a policy which allowed Eastern Europe to leave. Thirdly, the recent, and this is a kind of parochial example, I deal with Soviet Third World stuff, so something of it has to bubble up somewhere in this talk. The recent decision to open a Soviet interests section in the Austrian embassy in South Africa, and the analogous decision to allow a South African interest section to open in the Austrian embassy in Moscow, suggests that despite the apparently growing influence of individuals oriented towards a return to class struggle and support for liberation and all of those wonderful old slogans of Soviet foreign policy, the USSR continues in some respects to pursue a pragmatic policy based on concrete benefit, even when this undermines the last significant national liberation movement, the ANC in South Africa. On Gulf issues, although the Soviet Union pressed at the edges of our policy in the Gulf, although they made clear their opposition to it, and although they attempted to use their comparatively uncommitted position in the Gulf crisis to protect Saddam and to draw unilateral advantage at our expense, when push came to shove, they stayed on board. What we have then is a mixed bag in Soviet foreign policy as well, with some evidence of retreat from Shevardnadze's policy of close cooperation with the West and some evidence of continued adherence to the postulates of new thinking. If my analysis of the evolving domestic situation is correct, this should not be surprising. To the extent that, leaving politics aside, whoever is leading the Soviet Union remains committed to economic reform, they need to avoid the costs of a return to the Cold War. They need to continue to pursue economic rationality in relations with formerly heavily subsidized allies such as the East Europeans. They need, finally, Western economic assistance to move forward with perestroika. In this sense, despite the evidence of a hardening in Soviet foreign policy accompanying the shift in Soviet domestic politics, for the moment anyway, I do not anticipate fundamental change in the direction taken by the USSR in foreign policy since Gorbachev's coming to power. Movement forward will be slower than it was, as indeed it is. But backward movement is unlikely to be limited, not least because the international system itself has evolved. Given the experience of the past 5 years, for example, even if the Soviet Union sought to return to the promotion of socialism and socialist orientation in the Third World, there isn't much of an audience anymore, given the collapse of the Soviet economy. There's a good joke on this context, if you'll allow me to come close to an end with a joke. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are running away from cannibals. The cannibals are getting closer. Ronald Reagan, of course, reaches for his checkbook and writes a check for $5,000 and throws it over his shoulder in the hope that this will deter the pursuers. The chief of the band pursuing them looks at the check and throws it over his shoulder, continues the pursuit. He tries again with a $10,000 check. The result is the same. It becomes Mikhail Gorbachev's turn. He pulls out a slip of paper, writes something on it, throws it over his shoulder. The cannibals pick it up. They read it and they turn tail and run in the opposite direction. When President Reagan has caught his breath, he asks Mikhail Gorbachev, "What did you write?" And Gorbachev says, "It was very simple. All I had to do was write, 'This is the road to socialism.'" So much for the ideological appeal as an instrument of Soviet foreign policy. Recent changes in Europe have now become embedded in the European security system. Attempts to move back into Eastern Europe, should the Soviets ever want to do so, which, given the economic costs of doing so, they're unlikely to, such attempts would carry military, political, and economic risks the Soviets are unlikely to be willing to bear. Finally, although the USSR is hardly defenseless, its position in the balance of relative power has deteriorated considerably, while it faces, as we all know, a newly confident potential adversary in the United States, a United States which has left the Vietnam syndrome behind for good. Now, in this sense, despite the evidence of a hardening in Soviet foreign policy accompanying shifts in Soviet politics, as I said earlier, I don't anticipate a major change in direction. This presupposes, of course, the avoidance of collapse in the USSR. Indeed, the possibility of such a collapse is, for me anyway, far more disturbing than is the reality of conservative reaction. Thank you very much.
Professor McFarlane, we thank you for a richly comprehensive presentation. We look forward to the questions with great pleasure. Yes, sir, at the microphone.
Thank you for your analysis. I wanted to go into some history, and I think you gave some good background on the recent economic decline of the USSR. I wonder if you might speculate on why that decline and probably the overestimation of the Soviet GNP prior to 1985 wasn't reflected in United States policy, especially its defense policy. Of course, unless we were building up to a war with a country with the economic output of the state of Kentucky.
I think the question is, why did not the United States government fully anticipate the decline of the Soviet economy and cut back our budget, especially the military budget, accordingly?
I think that there were two issues underlying this failure of intelligence, if you will, perhaps in several senses of the word. The first is essentially, obviously, the Soviets have never published any data at all, and it's very hard to penetrate their system. The second, particularly their elaboration of statistics on their economy, they tend to overestimate. And you can't really go around touring Soviet plants to acquire an accurate estimate. The second is, of course, that the methods chosen to measure, or at least measure the equivalent of Soviet economic activity, were highly contentious and somewhat peculiar. To take an example, in Soviet defense spending, one of the questions I frequently asked in the intelligence establishment was, what is the dollar cost of Soviet defense spending? Of the Soviet defense establishment? What would it cost us, in other words, to produce that? Well, that's obviously going to lead you to the wrong answer in terms of what it costs the Soviet polity in terms of GNP. For example, it's a conscript army. A second example is that the production lines for Soviet equipment were so long and so sustained that essentially an average unit coming off the end, be it a tank or an artillery piece or an airplane, cost less per unit than a comparable unit for us. Our statistical techniques were deficient. We had inadequate data, and also, I suppose, one might argue that many of the, at the risk of offending some of you, for which I apologize in advance, one might argue that many of the agencies most responsible for assessing Soviet defense capability and Soviet GNP were also agencies who stood to benefit materially from an overestimation of that threat.
Yes, the far microphone.
Was there any debate within the Soviet military on whether to send a force to the Persian Gulf? Because at least it would seem in retrospect that a Soviet participation in the Allied victory would have heightened Soviet military prestige and won material gratitude from the West.
There was clearly debate in the Soviet Union on this question. Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, has referred to it, the ex-foreign minister has referred to it on a number of occasions. He referred to bad-mouthing accusations of people who argued that basically Shevardnadze wanted to send the Soviet military into the Gulf. To my knowledge, within the military itself, there was pretty solid opposition to sending units in support of a United States-led coalition. First of all, doing so, I think, runs counter to their world view, which continues to be that the United States is the principal potential enemy. Secondly, I don't think it would be clear to many of them whether Soviet prestige would be enhanced dramatically by so obviously playing second fiddle to us in the Gulf. And thirdly, I think that there was a lot of resistance to this notion from people who felt that it would muddy the water of Soviet-Arab relations, and most notably, of course, Soviet-Iraqi relations.
Mr. Isa?
You mentioned the referenda which took place yesterday in the two Baltic republics, Estonia and Latvia, and you also pointed out that you had not heard the latest news on the results. The latest information is that in Estonia, 78% voted for independence, and in Latvia, 74%. What makes that significant is that most of the no votes came from people not native to these countries who were brought in by the Soviets after the occupation of these countries after the Second World War. And the native population actually voted in both countries over 90% for independence. So my question to you is, in view of the very clear expression of national will in these two countries and also in Lithuania, what is, in your opinion, the future of these formerly independent states and nations, and what should be a United States policy be in this respect? Thank you.
I heard that. I was hoping when you presented the first part of your question that you would not present the second. I will nonetheless make an attempt. My own view is, and it's just a gut feeling, really. Given this expression of popular will, and also given the ambiguous history of the Baltic republics as supposed members of the Union, I think, and also given their comparative insignificance within the context of the Soviet economy, eventually there will be an orderly process of secession. And I think that many people I talk to in Moscow are willing to accept that process. These are Russians and Soviet officials, excuse me. But the precondition is, of course, preconditions are A, that the process be orderly, and B, that one can avoid somehow the creation of a demonstration effect whereby the departure of the Baltics encourages the others. But my suspicion ultimately is if the center is sustained, or sustains itself in the medium and long term, assuming there is no collapse, eventually they will be let go. With regard to American policy, on the Baltics. I think that there are two things to be said about that. The first is that our policy towards the Soviet Union has been based and is based, and I hope will continue to be based, on an array of priorities. One of which is, I hope, respect for the self-determination of minority peoples in the USSR. There are others, such as enhancing European security, the achievement of serious arms reduction agreements, avoidance of confrontation, and so on and so forth, and also not catering to conservative forces in the USSR, not provoking the very result we seek to avoid within the USSR. And of these is my own personal opinion, and I can easily say this because I'm not from the Baltics and I've never experienced Soviet oppression. It strikes me that the objectives of European security in general and strategic arms reduction, the creation of a stable relationship with the Union while it exists are probably, well, at least in my view, are more important values, given that we have to choose, than that of self-determination within the USSR. And I'd like to underline this point concerning provoking the response we don't want. Another consideration which has to play into American policy, it seems to me, is the possibility that if we come to act as if it was our design to detach constituent parts of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, I don't think we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of military suppression in the Baltics. Thank you.
Mr. Sherman.
May I add to this
Mr.
that
Isa.
you're of course aware that it's not a question of self-determination alone, that
Yes.
these were recognized independent countries, members of the League of Nations.
Quite right.
The only countries which were not returned to independence after the Second World War, and their independence is recognized by the United States to this point, and their occupation of the Soviet Union has never been recognized by U.S. government. They still have representation here. Thank you.
Exactly. I appreciate that addition. Thank you.
Mr. Sherman.
Good evening. First, thanks for the brilliance of your remarks and especially for your sense of humor, which you should continue to use whenever you can.
My wife says I have none.
Wives really bring us down to earth. Sir, you started to allude to some comments that you might have on a collapse scenario at the end of your talk, and I wondered if you'd care to elaborate on that, and at the same time tell me whether or not you feel that the United States State Department is capable of looking in on one foreign relations matter at a time, or can they really look on the Persian Gulf and look on the Soviet Union also at the same time?
I'll answer the second part first. Well, I have many friends who deal specifically with Soviet issues whose attention was not drawn away from those issues by the Gulf crisis. So at least at the analytical level, the attention of the department as a whole was not riveted on the Gulf question. I suppose if you reposed your question, you would then ask, well, what about the leadership? And there I'm not so sure. Indeed, there are people in my business who would argue that the reason that the more unpleasant aspects of the Soviet crackdown in the Baltics occurred between the 13th and the 17th or so of January, as the Soviets would say, that was no accident. It was a good window of opportunity because we were preoccupied. Now, with regard to the scenario of collapse, I'd like to say two things about that. One concerns its likelihood, and the second concerns its implications. Now, I am modest enough to admit that just about every prediction I've made concerning the Soviet Union over the past 6 years has been wrong. So you can take this with a grain of salt. I was trained to study the totalitarian neo-Stalinist Brezhnev system, and then they changed it on me, you see. But with that in mind, I would say, firstly, that the prospect of collapse is somewhat less serious than many people in my business would suggest. I mean, you talk to some people in my business as if it's coming apart at the seams as we speak. My impression of the past couple or 3 months is that the center continues to enjoy considerable residual power. Nor is the military as divided or ineffectual as we were told in the summer and fall, so I think they can hold the line for a while. The implications of collapse, should it occur, and why it is more disturbing to me than conservative reaction. Well, again, that's easy for me to say because I live in Charlottesville and not in Moscow. But it seems to me that there are several potentially disturbing consequences of, let us say, a collapse of central authority and the beginnings of civil war. Civil war is not beyond the realm of possibility, since almost every republic in the USSR has territorial claims against other republics, since there are significant minority populations in each of the national republics, and so on. The various hooks on which you could hang a conflict are practically imminent. Civil conflict and possible war within the Union has, I think, some prospect of spilling over into Eastern Europe, which is contiguous. 2, to the extent that there is not clear, sustained command and control over major weapons systems, such as, for example, nuclear weapons, there is some possibility of their use, which would have universal impacts. Thirdly, economic collapse or civil war and political breakdown would probably cause massive refugee flows, which would be difficult for the East Europeans and then the West Europeans to sustain. It would have consequences for the economies of Western Europe and for us, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just a mess, in short, the prospect, and that's why it concerns me.
Professor McFarlane, we thank you for sharing your scholarship with us.